Which countries at the moment have got the worst demographics? Which countries
The
should be,
worst,
yeah, which countries should be very concerned about the ratio of young to old?
the worst in the world is China. They've been in the process of updating their data over the course of the last couple of years, and they're now starting to publicly admit that they overcounted by 100 million people. All of those people would have been born since one child, so age 40 and under, the young worker demographic, the childbearing demographic, and two-thirds of them are probably women. So best guess is that China only has 1.3 billion people now. The population probably peaked more than 10 years ago. And by 2030, there will be more retirees than workers. And by 2050, the entire population of China will have dropped below 650 million.
That's wild.
It's beyond terminal. Yeah, so the Chinese system collapses this decade for sure. Assuming nothing else goes wrong. And there's plenty other competitors to put the bullet in China's head.
Dude, that is crazy. Okay, so
yeah, all the way from pre-industrial to post-industrial collapse in 45 years.
Just for the people that don't understand about how the one-child policy and the preference for boys over girls and stuff created this landscape, what's the high-level view of that?
Sure. Well, there's two things. First of all, of course, is one child. Mao was concerned that they had a young upcoming generation after World War II that was going to eat the country alive. So they went to a two-child policy, ultimately to a one-child policy, and that was not loosened until 2015. But by that point, the damage was already done because there was a second factor. Remember, countries that industrialize later can follow the path of those who came before. They can skip some steps. So China was the fastest ever industrialization experience. What the United Kingdom did in 7 generations, the Chinese did in 1. And so they crammed 7 generations of economic growth and development into 1. And that's why their growth rate has been so impressive. But you can only do that once. And now it's behind them. And now they have no children. And they have very few people under age 45.
Is population growth and collapse similar to an R0 number in a way, that more people allow you to have more children, which gives you more people to have more children, but if the reverse is happening, then it causes a nosedive?
You're absolutely right there. Now, I don't want to say that unchecked population growth is necessarily the way to go. That's not what I'm after here. I mean, you require a balance between children, young workers, and mature workers. If you don't have enough mature workers, you don't have the capital. If you don't have enough young workers, you don't have the consumption. If you don't have the children, you don't have a future. China is already out of those last two categories. And so we know where this leads. It leads to zero.
Given the fact that humans are being, I think it's every 3 generations lives for another generation at the moment. Around about every generation lives 8 years longer than the generation before. Increased healthcare, health span, better access to.
That is only true in the shift from pre-industrial to industrial.
So you get that once.
Well, it depends upon how you apply the lessons to your system. In the case of Europe, I'd say they got it 3 times. But there's definitely an upper limit. One of the things to keep in mind, especially when you're talking about European demographics, is that in Europe, people are not living longer. Overall lifespan has not improved. What's improved is we've gotten rid of a lot of mortality. So the things that used to kill you when you were 0 to 65 don't kill you anymore.
Right, okay. That is going to change the shape of demographics as well, right? The fact that young people are able to get old more easily, say.
More safely.
More safely, yeah, precisely. So I guess there's just a lot, over the last 100 years, we've seen such change. It's not just been technological change, but downstream from that is what's happened demographically and how that's influenced the demography. Okay, so if
modern medicine, electricity, sewage.
Yep.
Yeah.
If China's got the worst, what are some of the areas that have got better looking demography?
The 3 countries in the world, in the advanced world, actually in the advanced and in the developing world, New Zealand, France, United States, and largely for the same reason. They're countries that have a little bit more physical space So their cities tend to be more of a sprawl. You're more likely to have a backyard. More people can live in the countryside and be economically viable. So when these three countries urbanized, they did it at a slower rate, and they remain the three advanced countries with the lowest urbanization rates in the world. In the advanced developing world, the closest one is going to be Mexico, and for similar reasons. Central Mexico, which is on a highland massif, is just one giant suburban sprawl. And that means that people can have more children. Now, all of these countries still have their own demographic hiccups. They all have the baby boomer problem. It's just that they all have replacement generations.
I had a conversation with Jordan Peterson about this at the start of the year, and I did some research before. Is the country with the highest current birth rate per family Chad? Could be somewhere in Africa, I'm going to guess, with around about 8.
Probably somewhere in Central Africa. Yeah, Chad, Nigeria, that cluster.
But I'm going to guess that just lots of children isn't necessarily a good answer either, because you then lock yourself into potential futures. You can't birth any more or fewer 5-year-olds now. It's whatever happens this year is now.
5 years ago, yeah.
Yep, precisely.
So in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, and this is a very broad array of countries, it's very difficult to make a generalization. They've started to industrialize. And so they're going down the same path that everybody else did. And the first step of that path is lowering infant and child mortality. And so when 1 out of 3 children don't die, you have an explosion in your birth rate. But if you play that forward 10, 15 years, then you start having adjustments in family planning, and you get smaller and smaller families as urbanization kicks in. The danger for countries that are in this category who've taken the first but not the second step is that they've imported a lot of the technologies of industrialization, which has helped them out, but they have not developed the systems to sustain that themselves. So if something happens to the outside environment, they lose all of the benefits.
What, like?
Healthcare, medicines, fertilizers. It's very easy for me to see a lot of these countries facing famine in the not too distant future, because if you break down globalization, yes, that means it's difficult to get oil or manufactured goods. I'm more concerned about agriculture. Agriculture is by far the most delicate and vulnerable of the economic sectors because it needs the equipment, it needs the finance, it needs the fertilizers, it needs the trade options. You break any of those, the whole system falls apart. And with the Ukraine war, we are seeing massive disruptions to the fertilizer sector. With some of the decisions the Chinese have made, same thing. So we're already looking this year at losing roughly a third of global fertilizer supply. That is going to haunt us for a decade.
Wow. Okay, so for the people that maybe haven't been able to work out why it is that increasing urbanization and education and development causes a reduction in birth rate, can you just explain that for us?
Sure. It's a wide array of factors. So when you move into a city, you have less room, and that just changes the mechanics of raising kids. When you move off the farm, kids are no longer free labor. You have fewer of them. When you urbanize, when you have electricity, you've generated time. And so people can do things after sunset. This is important for everything in terms of economic development, but it's most important for women. Because if a woman moves off the farm and into the city and all of a sudden can do something after hours, you have the opportunity for mass education and freeing them from doing more than just being mothers. Nothing wrong with being a mother, but it's a full-time job on the farm. In the city, you're going to have fewer kids. That's less time allotted, and you have a greater chance to, read. And so the entire women's right movement is basically linked indelibly to electricity. And once you have it, women have fewer kids because they now have other things going on in their lives that compete for attention.
They can go and get jobs. They can pursue careers. They can do research. Yes, interesting.
We absolutely. I mean, the British example with the cotton mills was probably the best example. The first group of people to urbanize weren't the men; it was the women, and we saw the impact on birth rates.
Going back to what you said there about food shortages and the delicacy of agriculture, I'm seeing a lot of videos come out, shaky phone videos come out of China at the moment. Just how bad, is there any reliable information about how bad food and the future of food will be in China?
It's getting difficult to get good information out of China. It's really devolved into a cult of personality state, even stricter than what Mao Zedong had. I don't think that the Chinese have a food crisis that is impacting their ability to have calories at the moment. Chinese land is among the worst in the world, and so it requires a huge amount of fertilizer to grow anything, specifically phosphate for rice. It's by far the world's most phosphate-hungry crop, and the Chinese traditionally, because of that, have been the world's largest producer and exporter of the stuff. The problem is actually with African swine fever. Now, you may have heard of that a few years ago. They had a big outbreak. They ended up culling more hogs from their farms than the rest of the world's commercial farms have hogs. Just give you an idea of just how lopsided the pork market is. It's 2/3 of it is China. They went to rebuild their herds, but they never abrogated the debts for the farmers who went out of business. They just offered subsidies to bring in new people. They thought that would be cheaper. Well, you have now 2 million new hog farmers in China who have no idea what they're doing. And let's just say that phytosanitary does not translate into Mandarin well in the first place. So we're probably in the early stages of a second wave of ASF that'll probably be just as bad, if not worse, than the first one. So pork, just like it did 2-3 years ago, is about to fall off the market in China completely. That just leaves rice. So the Chinese have banned the export of phosphate fertilizer. In the short term, this is causing massive problems in agricultural producers in East and South Asia. Australia, especially Western Australia, is probably the part that's gotten hit hardest. Brazil is feeling the impacts. Western Australia and Brazil basically can't grow without fertilizer. They don't have soil in the way that we think of the term. It's a weird geology. But you interrupt the input flows, and it's very difficult to grow food at volume. And China, in the best of times, is on a razor's edge in terms of food sustainability, and they use about 3 to 6 times as much fertilizer as is used in the global average, just because their land is so poor. Luckily, phosphate they've got covered. They produce that themselves, but the nitrogen is all made with imported natural gas, and the phosphate, the potash, half of that comes from a different continent. So, yeah, China, demographic collapse, unavoidable. Food collapse, highly likely. And that's before you start talking about things like energy manufacturing and trade.
Does this not make China unbelievably dangerous?
The question is, what would you do if you're China? Where would you go to get what you want? If you go into Kazakhstan, fine, but what does the winner get? You can't go to India. Himalayas are in the way. You could go into Vietnam, but when the Chinese did that last in 1979, they got treated just as well as the Americans were. And so that was a quick war. They don't have the Navy to push out. Japan and Taiwan could go nuclear in a month.
Hang on.
That just leaves Russia.
We heard there's China are taking over the South China Sea. There's all of these small islandettes that they're putting together. They've got this scary, big, armed forces that's going to come and take over everything. Is that not the case? Are they not as strong militarily as they have we been told?
Really not. They have made significant strides over the last 30 years. I don't mean to belittle that, but everything they're doing in the South China Sea was designed to intimidate Vietnam and the Philippines into cowering, and it had the opposite effect. And both countries just ran to Japan and now have defense packs. It doesn't really allow the Chinese to project power very far either. They do have a lot of ships. They've got like a 650-ship navy, but 90% of them are really small and can't sail more than 1,500 kilometers from the coast. And that assumes they're going slow in a straight line and no one's shooting at them. In actual combat conditions, they can maybe make it 600K. So they don't have the power projection, and they're the country in the world that is most dependent on reaching the world in order to reach markets and resources.
What's happening, people? If you enjoyed that, then press here for the full, unedited episode. And don't forget to subscribe. Peace.